Well, this is a bit of a deja vu situation. I just built the exact same computer less than a month ago. As these things sometimes go, when life gives you lemons, well, you know the rest. Funny enough, I ended up with the same motherboard, CPU, RAM, amount and frequency as my last build, so I almost did not do the video, instead just relying on my older one. Well, to a point. Particular machine consists of a Ryzen 3 3200G, which I originally sold more than a year ago and came back to me for an upgrade. It is a brand new kit of 2666 Crucial. The motherboard is an Asus A320 Prime MK that I updated to the latest BIOS. Cooling is taken care of by a Ryzen 5 stock cooler. The build, as you can see, went very smoothly for the most part, just the included AeroCool fan gave me some trouble. I feel compelled to call it user error, but the root cause is non-standard parts. Whenever I have a fan with a Molex connection, I reverse it to 5 volts because most fans will happily run slower on 5 volts. Especially on lower power machines like this one, you don't need a 12 volt raging fan. What I didn't know is that the 5 volt ARGB LEDs were drawing power from the same Molex. For the uninitiated, standard RGB and ARGB fans have completely different power circuitry for the fan and the LEDs. Simply, they do not draw power from the same source. As I later discovered, this fan has its own controller and is not drawing power for the LEDs from the non-standard cable, just a signal where you press the LED button in the front of the case. Story short, I killed the fan's LED controller on first boot up and had to replace the stock strip with a white LED one. All in all, it still looks good, so no permanent harm done. Benchmarks in this video are taken from the previous runs. I reconfirmed quickly in a couple of titles that indeed the numbers line up perfectly, so I decided there is no need to run all the tests again for no apparent reason. Benchmarking a specific hardware configuration from time to time makes absolute sense because games and apps evolved and they become more demanding or in some cases more optimized, so the performance will naturally vary. But really not from one month to the next. It's the moment I kill the LED controller. Notice how the fan is flickering. Those LEDs are now being fed double the voltage they need to run. Whoops. If I were to keep running them like this, they eventually will all burn out. Anyhow, thankfully the front RGB strip is a-okay. The fan itself is absolutely fine, so no problems there. Let's now have a look at a few pictures of the finished build and then it's on to the benchmarks. Of the performance investigation as per usual with Heaven, and I won't dwell too much on the benchmarks that haven't changed from previous runs, as I'm more interested in testing the APU against the titles I never had a chance to pit it against, such as Far Cry 6 and Warzone. Here though, we get an entirely predictable 28.8 FPS, which means we are on the right track as there is no weird bottleneck present. Next is Superposition. I'm happy to report that for whatever reason the 3200G this time has posted a slightly better score than the first time I tested it. Not sure why. I mean, 14.5 FPS doesn't sound like an amazing result. Truthfully is not, but considering this is a modern GPU scorcher of a benchmark, that is to be expected. Rocket League is definitely playable at Full HD with the settings cranked all the way up, but considering that the average is only 32 FPS for what is a very fast-paced game, I think some fiddling with the settings is required. If you go to the other end of the spectrum and turn everything down, the average shoots up to 96 FPS on average, which is very playable and competitive. With a bit of finesse, a happy medium between FPS and eye candy can be had with medium settings at 60 FPS with VSync on. Fortnite with everything set to epic is simply not playable with 17 FPS on average. Thankfully, dropping down to medium settings with epic draw distance is enough to turn it into a good experience. There will be some frame drops here and there, but it is inevitable to the game engine in my experience. If that is not enough for you, going to low with epic draw distance further increases the average FPS to over 100 from 56, and after a short period of unexplicable shutters, when the game loads, it's smooth sailing. Performance mode is similar to low, maybe with a bit better frame time pacing and 10 to 20 extra FPS on average depending on the scenario, but I still feel that it somehow washes out the colors a little bit. In my opinion, this is only worth enabling if your monitor supports over 120Hz, in which case it would be an odd pairing with an APU powered machine. Horizon Zero Dawn spits out a very ominous warning that the PC specifications are below the minimum requirements. This is mostly due to the 2GB RAM buffer that is allocated to the iGPU, so thankfully you can go ahead and ignore it. At 720p low settings, it averages an impressive 35 FPS with remarkably little frame drops in the included benchmark. The in-game average is closer to 40 FPS, and dare I say it, some settings can even be bumped up a bit. Assassin's Creed Valhalla provided very pleasant surprise with 43 FPS on average. This is an incredible increase from the 36 FPS average it posted last time I tested it on a 3200G. It just goes to show how patches can make a huge performance difference, and all data needs to be periodically re-evaluated, otherwise you might draw the wrong conclusions. The extra boost in performance means that now we can dial up some visual effects, increasing the immersion further. This is my first time benchmarking Days Gone on an APU, and it does not disappoint. This effectively is running at 720p with resolution scalings, and it averages 43 FPS. Thankfully, this game looks very good regardless of graphical settings, and considering I managed to fight off a horde without dying, I can say it runs very well indeed. Side note, the main bottleneck here is the memory speed followed by the CPU, as I tried the 3600 Mbps kit off camera and the frame rate shot up to 48 FPS on average, making the memory speed followed by the CPU speed the primary bottlenecks and not the GPU. Weird, eh? Warzone runs well with the settings the game chooses for itself, running with about 52 FPS on average. One cannot call this ideal, but it is 100% playable and enjoyable, and it will serve well until a GPU is installed somewhere down the line. Some settings though are inexplicably left on high, so there is scope for dialing them down even further if so desired, eking out a few extra FPS. What about something old that is now new? Diablo 2 runs very well indeed with medium settings and very well when in legacy mode. Thankfully, hundreds of FPS are not really required in this game unless you are running nightmare mode, in which case I am truly sorry for your sanity when your character inevitably dies. You have my deepest sympathy and condolences. Considering I haven't played Far Cry 6 yet, I am limiting myself to the included benchmark to not spoil anything. This is a mixed bag, unfortunately. On the one hand, it supports FSR, which pushes the average FPS to 42, making the game very playable. Alternatively, if for some reason you don't like FSR, there are artifacts, sure, but in order to spot them you have to be really dedicated. Then adaptive resolution is available, keeping the average at 31 FPS. Still playable, but maybe not as smooth. The bad news though is that this is a single-threaded bound game, something that is utterly ridiculous in 2021. Leaving a lot of performance on the table due to bad coding, especially for lower end systems like this. I have tested Cyberpunk before on a 3400G and called it borderline playable, but not quite there. I was going into this with a preconceived notion that it wasn't playable at all, but I must admit I was wrong. By dropping everything to low, there are still unavoidable dips toward the mid-20s, but they are not as frequent or as dire as they once were. I am not sure how I feel about this. I will still not recommend it, but if you don't really have another choice and you can't wait until you save up even for a GTX 970, if you can't wait for a 1060 or 1660, then good news. With a bit of tweaking and community mods, it is, well, playable. Remember, what I'm showing here is the absolute worst case scenario of roaming around downtown Night City. For most of the missions, the FPS will hover around 39 on average. The issue I have with this game is that unlike the other titles we looked at today, Cyberpunk looks flat, and at least for me a great part of its appeal is in its visuals, looking more like a game from 10 years ago than one that just came out last year. And with that we conclude another video. I hope you enjoyed it and see you in the next one.